All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Colin Glover from Sarah Bren. We are all at home today, and hopefully this is going to work out well. We've got some storms here in the southeastern part of Virginia, so hopefully we're not going to lose power or anything today. So also on the line with me today is Alexi Johnson. Alexi is an expert in all things compliance and is going to help us learn more about access control. Hopefully everybody can see my slides today, and we're going to go through this real quick. I'm sure you've talked to us before. I've seen that I'm sure you're familiar with Sarah Bren. We are a third-party assessment organization. We do PCI QSA. We like to do cyber risk management and compliance. We do a lot of work with higher ed, as well as the defense industrial base. And we want to help you create a secure, compliant, and cost-effective environment. All right, so as everybody I'm sure is aware, the cybersecurity maturity model, cybersecurity maturity model certification is still in process of being developed. The auditing standards are not out. There is no one who is an expert yet in CMMC. I know, and I think I probably mentioned this last time, the Defense Department has come out and kind of dinged folks that said they were experts in CMMC. We are not, nobody is. We're not going to be able to provide you specific guidance on configurations for your environment. We don't know your environment. This is your environment. What we want to do is provide some broad outlines on how to get started with this. If this is your first time dealing with it, or even if you've been dealing with it for a while and just haven't been able to get there, we need to help you out with this. All right. So Alexi and I are going to talk a little bit, kind of the format. You know, I like to ask Alexi questions. He's really smart, and he helps teach me about all these things. So we're just going to kind of talk through this and kind of understand what all this stuff looks like. So today is access control. It is the first domain or control family from 171 or 53. It's really, really big. There's at least 22 controls under the access control domain, or now there's 22 practices, if you will, in levels 1 through 3. So it's an important domain, and really up there with configuration management, which we talked about last time, is key to a successful security program. Without access control, you're kind of not going to be able to do much. So access control. This is where we're going to start. Alexi, what is access control?
So access control, NIST has a definition for access control that I will state, but then we'll look at it in layman's terms. The process of granting access to information technology system resources and making sure that it's only granted to authorized users, programs, processes, or other systems. Access control really, looking at it from a simple analogy standpoint, you have a front door to your house, and the process that you go through to determine who gets a key to that door is what access control is. Once somebody gets an account, that's the key into your network. So access control is the process that governs how you provide access and what levels of access that you actually provide to any user in your environment. And that actually says why it's important as well. We talked about doing configuration management from an inventory standpoint, that you can't secure what you don't know about, so an inventory is important. Well, in similar fashion, access control is important because it follows along with the same thought process. You have to be aware of who has access to your environment and to ensure that only they have access to your environment to ensure that you're keeping security.
So going along with your analogy, if access control is like having keys to a house, you want to know who has keys to your house, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's pretty important. All right. So where do we start?
The very first thing that you do is, I know you probably already know this, but you kind of, in some ways, want to know who works for you, and then you want to know what they do for you. So figuring out who needs access, that's who works for you, and figuring out what access they need, that's the beginning for it all. Are you going to have a system administrator? Are you going to have a database administrator? Are you going to have an email administrator? Or maybe you're going to have a comptroller who's going to be responsible for timekeeping and payroll, things like that. You want to know first who they are, and then what do they need to be able to do. And after that, you want to find out how exactly are they going to connect to your network. And after you know that, you put some rules in place to govern everything that came before.
All right, makes sense. And I think we're probably going to talk about ground rules a little bit.
Absolutely.
All right. Oh, and we got to enforce those ground rules.
Yes, I thought it was one more, but I wasn't sure. So after you establish the rule, if you don't enforce the rule, then there's going to be a problem.
All right. So I like this slide. So we got to create an employee list. Where can we find an employee list, Alexi?
So in many cases, your human resources department, if you have one, they're going to have a list of all the employees that work for the company. So that's always a good place to begin if you're trying to establish an employee list. You really don't have to, because you already have it in most cases.
Absolutely. And should you go over it with somebody or just accept it as it is? I mean, maybe you have temporary workers. How often does this employee list have to be updated?
So this is one of those things that should be updated real time. If you're going to have an employee list, in most cases, if you don't have contractors or if you don't have temporary employees, some level of review, monthly, quarterly, may suffice. But if you're going to have temporary workers, you should at least be reviewing this listing to make sure that it's accurate at some, a higher level of frequency. It really depends on what the turnover rate is and how often, you're going to plus up, plus down, things like that.
Very good. And next on your list, you have the established roles. Now, for, say, a small business, are they going to have a sysad, a domain ad, a network admin? A lot of places you've been and I've been, they just have one person that's the IT guy. What's that look like?
Well, so you're absolutely right. In many cases, you have a few people, or rather, we're talking specifically about small business. Excuse me 1 second, Colin. A little bit of technical
Sure.
difficulty.
I think Alexi's getting a headset on, so stand by for just a second. And while we're waiting, I don't think I addressed this in the opening. If you have questions or concerns or any comments on any of these things, feel free to jump on the chat.
I think I should be good now.
All right, there's Alexa.
Okay. Sorry about that. Trying to, my device that I was using for voice started acting a little crazy. So I switched over to a landline. It just took me a second to get in. Where were we?
All right, I think we were talking about small business and admins. And we're going to talk about privileges again, but just a thought. Right.
So oftentimes you'll have a small business and you may have one IT person fulfilling multiple roles. But if you look at just a little snips from a spreadsheet on the screen, it's always a good idea to still denote the levels of access that you have from a role-based standpoint, so that you can always know, because there are requirements, to make sure that you separate duties of your employees. So it can at least give you an idea from a sense of, okay, maybe today I only have one person that's fulfilling an IT role, but you may need to actually add on some employees to kind of make this more effective. Not absolutely a requirement. There are ways to get around it. But doing things like establishing roles and determining the permissions for those roles kind of really helps you get a leg up on understanding what it's going to be.
All right. So very good. I think that's fairly self-explanatory. All right, privileged users. I have to deal, I'm sure everybody has to deal with this quite a bit. What's a privileged user, Alexi?
Well, a privileged user really is anybody who is going to be doing one of two things. Either, well, I won't say one of two things. You're going to have elevated access over what a standard user will have. You may be able to install software, or you may be able to update security functionality, maybe log into a domain controller, or you may be able to access a network device and some higher level of access than just let me use the computer to check my email and create Word documents and things like that.
So what do you mean by network device?
A network device, something like a router or maybe a switch, where the cables are actually plugged in to allow the ones and zeros to travel across the network.
Okay, so like your firewall would be a big idea behind that, right?
Absolutely. A firewall, and as a matter of fact, that kind of goes into what security functions are, because a firewall, just by definition, a security function is anytime you're making changes to hardware, software, and or firmware for the purpose of enforcing security policy. So when you look at a firewall, that falls under the umbrella of where you would actually administer security functions, because deciding what type of traffic is going to be allowed in and out of your network would fall under a security function, as well as administering Active Directory or maybe administering local system accounts on a computer, because those are all security functions. So you always want to restrict access to your personnel to ensure that only a select group of people get an opportunity to do those things.
Now, that select group of people, should they use their regular account to do all this stuff?
That is a great question. I'm just going to ask that everybody who works for a company that's on the call, if you have one account and that account allows you to install software and you use that account regularly, just raise your hand. I can actually see you through cyberspace. So for those of you who raised your hand, now use your other hand and just give it a little slap on the wrist. That is a very, very, very bad thing. If you're going to have an administrator, it's okay if you have a regular user who is also an administrator, but you definitely want to make sure that they at least have a separate user account that they use for their administration. Because if by chance their regular account becomes compromised and it's a privileged account, then they can find ways to pivot across your network, and it's going to be very difficult to stop some level of attack that starts that way. Very, very difficult. Not an issue if, maybe you're a local system administrator and maybe you have regular work that you're going to do, but you should always have a separate account to separate the levels of work that you're going to be doing. All day-to-day access, web browsing, creating Word documents, corresponding with other employees or customers is going to be very different than dealing with administrative actions that are going to take place on the system.
All right.
It looks like there's a question that came in kind of related to it.
Yeah.
The difference in a local admin and a domain admin. So the real difference here is it basically involves the use of a network. So I want to assume that everybody is going to be using Active Directory. But if you're a domain admin, that means that you generally have access to administer the domain functionality. Whatever that centralized level of access control that you're using, that would be a domain admin. Versus a local admin, you may have access to one individual system. That would make you a local admin versus being a domain admin. The real difference is are you controlling things over a network, or are you controlling an individual device, which is what would determine, local versus domain.
I think his question here is regarding, do you need separate accounts if you have a local admin for a regular user? And so before you get to, one thing I want to address is, according to DoD, users can have local admin. That's not a privileged account, according to their frequently asked questions guide. I forget which question. But one thing to keep in mind is change control. When we talked about configuration management in March, change control has to apply to those users. So even if you do want to allow them to make changes to their local system, they still have to go through that change management process. So DoD defines privileged as those security functions. And so really you're talking about network or domain level changes. But if you allow users to have local admin rights, then they have to be controlled, and changes to their system have to be controlled through a change management process, which, to be honest, many users are not going to adhere to all the time. So something to be very cautious with.
There's actually a second piece to that as well. When you think in terms of security functions, antivirus, host-based firewall systems, things like that, generally a privileged user they can actually affect those things. So if you're going to have your regular users to be local admins, you have to now take into account maybe that determines that maybe I don't use Windows Defender. Maybe I need a third-party antivirus product that a user cannot affect with their privileged access to their account. Maybe you need something that requires an additional password to avoid security functionality actually being changed. So that's why we often recommend that you don't allow your users to be local admins, because they actually still get access to some higher level security functions that'll be very difficult to prevent them from doing, if they wanted to try to do some of those things.
So the full answer is local admin can be cut off from security functions by definition, but it's probably not a good idea. And
Absolutely.
there's got to be additional configuration around it to meet all the requirements. And so again, for a small business, can we talk about separation of duties a bit? It's a one-person show. They do everything. How do they appropriately navigate that separation?
So separation of duties can actually be handled a few different ways. Obviously, in most environments, you may be the only person with the experience to be able to actually perform a job, so separation may be tough. But that's where things like two-person concept, where maybe before you actually make a definitive action, maybe somebody witnesses it, or maybe somebody actually will make the decision and you institute the decision. It doesn't mean that they're going to be highly technical, but maybe you use some level of change advisory process where before you actually do something, you can try to separate it that way. Because generally, a lot of small businesses, your network administrator, your local admin, your system admin, your domain admin, it may be the same person. So if you can figure out a way to at least allow a conversation to take place so that the approval flow doesn't rest with that one individual who's going to do every action, maybe allow somebody else within the organization to determine what actions are going to be taken, not necessarily from a technical standpoint, but at least to approve the actions that are going to take place.
Well, I think, and we were talking earlier, and you brought up a really good point from the Air Force, for a system account, there's a paper trail for that system account. So, maybe by policy, you can't set up an account until you have authorization from HR or a manager. And then you go back and audit all those system accounts on a periodic basis. Would that be separation?
Absolutely. That would definitely help with it. Once you deal with your log management and being able to determine, okay, what's actually being done here, definitely will help to determine, is this person acting appropriately, more in line with exactly what their duties are versus, are they kind of, going off the radar a bit.
And so we have a note from Charles, isn't that a security administrator's job? And then absolutely it is. But many places we go, they just don't have the resources to have a security administrator. So it oftentimes is a one-person shop, or even using an MSP. So there's just not, separation of duties. In certain environments is kind of the struggle, where they don't have somebody that has a technical experience to review changes. But yeah, if you have the resources to have a security administrator to do the audits, that's perfect. That's a best world scenario. And hopefully more resources be made available to implement these kinds of requirements. But today, if it's one person, then we kind of got to go roll through it. Let me see here. So Ralph, I think we'll tackle your question at the end. And to Mark, you're right. That can be very true, that nobody in the company is going to have a clue what the network admin is talking about with his functions. 9 times out of 10, that can be very true, but typically at least you want that paper trail, that the changes, whatever, if it's functional change, at least put it before somebody that has some technical savvy to make that decision. There's no great answer to this at this time. It's really developing a solution that works in your environment. Does that make sense, Alexi?
Oh, absolutely. I was going to actually comment on the same one and pretty much mention what you said.
Okay. All right. So I think we'll move along to connecting to your network. Always a fun time. How do people connect to the network, Alexi?
There's often a lot of different ways. Obviously, we're employing one of those methods today, where it be some level of remote access. I'm starting from the bottom, obviously, because of what the times are. COVID-19 has created a scenario where you're going to have more remote workers where they may connect via VPN or some level of virtual desktop infrastructure, maybe using Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or some other platform. But for your people on premise, they may have wired access where there's actually going to be a physical network cable plugged into their system, or maybe they have wireless access. But no matter how they're connecting, you want to have an idea of what their connection mechanism is, because you can't secure that mechanism if you don't know what it is. So just keeping documentation of what those methods are, because once we get into establishing ground rules, all of your ground rules are based on what your connection mechanisms are. But it all starts as well with having an inventory, because one of the requirements under access control is to limit access to not just authorized users, but also to authorized devices. So having an inventory of your systems will help with that, because you'll have information on your computer, such as maybe a MAC address. Yes, a MAC address can be spoofed, but still having that type of information available in some of the other particulars can help you identify if you have a system that's operating in your environment that shouldn't be there, simply because you have a listing of what should be there.
Now, Alexi, for the VPN, can I just go out and buy some VPN and throw it up and start using that? Would that be authorized? Isn't there some specific requirement for that?
There is a 100% requirement, and I think it falls under a different category. Is it in this one? It may be in access control, but there's this thing called FIPS validated.
Yeah.
You have FIPS validated cryptographic modules that have to be used to protect the confidentiality of CUI, or rather to protect the confidentiality of remote sessions. So if you're going to use a VPN, ensure that you validate that the modules being used are on the cryptographic module validation list, to make sure that you won't have any issues. Because if you just go out and buy a random device that can provide you VPN, it may not provide an adequate or allowed level of security to your environment. So just make sure that you look for those lists. And I'll say that again, there is a cryptographic module validation program. So if you're going to use a device that offers VPN and you're going to have a covered defense information or a CUI within your environment, you're going to need to make sure that VPN device has cryptography that's certified under that particular program.
Awesome.
Same with the VDI. If you're going to use Amazon Web Services, same thing. You have to make sure that whatever your remote mechanism is, that it's appropriately validated, and there is a program for it, and there's a list of all of the modules that have been validated and a list of the devices that are currently in the process of being validated.
So one question I have, and maybe we don't want to get too deep into it right now, but and particularly with this current environment, is Office 365. And
Office 365
connecting to Office
is always
365.
fun.
It is. And so I don't think we should get too deep into it, but should remote connections to a 365 be considered in this scope? And it just came to me, so I apologize for not thinking it through previously.
I don't know if I understand completely when you say remote. You mean as far as just being able to log into like the web applications through remote?
Yeah, being able to. Yeah, being able to log into those.
So really what it depends on is whether or not you are bringing that environment in scope. And when I say in scope, are you actually going to be storing, processing, or transmitting CUI in that environment? If the answer to that question is no, then it may be okay to allow those web applications to be used from non-trusted devices. But if you're going to bring those items into scope and store, process, or transmit CUI, then you should be selective about what levels of access you provide from untrusted devices, because a compromise of someone's home system could potentially allow your Office 365 environment to be breached. And if you have CUI or CDI in there, you're really increasing your risk at that point.
Awesome. Thank you.
Now, I do want to address one thing. There is a comment that mentions not allowed unless GCC high. So Microsoft has actually attested that their GCC environment does meet the CUI requirements under DFARS as well. So they've actually added that information to their site also. So obviously, you know, with CMMC and things like that, they may have to be certified as well to go further than their own attestation, but they have mentioned that they do meet the requirements under the incident reporting for the DFARS clause.
Very good, thanks. And that's a great question. Yeah, I forget the gentleman's name. I think it's Matthew Wakefield. He's an Azure. He works for Microsoft Azure, and he's written a number of blogs on this topic. If it's a question you have, I certainly recommend reading his write-ups. They go into great detail about how Microsoft handles this kind of information.
I think it's Richard Wakeman.
Richard Wakeman, that's what it was.
Yeah, Richard Wakeman, Wakeman.
Yeah,
and believe it or not, so we've actually been in communication with the DoD CIO, and they've actually pointed us to the information that was published by Richard Wakeman, and saying that, you know, obviously commercial, no go, but once you get into the GCC and the GCC high realm, both are adequate. Typically, the reason you jump to the GCC high is once you get into a situation where you require some level of U.S. sovereignty for maybe some export control data, or maybe CJCS, or some higher level of classification under that controlled unclassified umbrella. That's where you may need to definitely jump into GCC high at that point.
Awesome, thanks. All right. So now we're going to establish some ground rules. I like ground rules.
Ground rules are very important. This is probably, if you don't put these ground rules in place and your users are never made aware of what's allowed and what's not allowed, then it's going to be the wild, wild west. So you can simply start that out by just creating an acceptable use policy. What are the general things that you allow your employees to do? Some companies actually have in their acceptable use policy that Facebook is allowed. Some people have within their policy that Facebook is not allowed. Now, I don't think necessarily that speaks to security, probably more towards productivity, but whatever the general system use is going to be, whether it's if you're allowing remote access, how that actually works. If you're going to allow portable storage devices, what are the rules that govern how they're going to access portable storage devices? Company devices versus bring your own device. What are the rules surrounding that? You know, and making sure that the employees understand definitively what some of these big items are. Multi-factor authentication, making sure that they understand that it's going to be used when required. Making sure that they understand what they can share, what they can't share, making sure that they understand what they can post and what the approval processes are. You know, those are the things that your acceptable use policy will cover, because many of those things will be, sometimes you just can't solve every problem with technology. Sometimes you have to have policy in place. And that's what that acceptable use policy is going to help you with, versus the IT security policy, which is now where the technology is going to come in place to help augment whatever your ground rules are. So whether it's mobile device management to control how data flows on maybe an iPhone or an Android device. I'm Android all the way. Hopefully many of you are as well. Whether you're going to use group policy to establish security configurations. You know, what's your policy around wireless access regarding encryption and authentication? You know, what are your policies around remote access? Are you ensuring that you're using a FIPS validated cryptographic module for your remote access? And even down to encryption. Once you establish all of those things, that kind of flows into the next one of actually enforcing those things.
So once you get to enforcement, maybe you're going to cover that. This mobile device management, you know, we don't issue phones. Our employees are access, but we expect them to respond to email at any time of day. So they're going to get company email. How does that flow within? It's a bring your own device for a phone, but they're connecting to company resources. What's that look like?
So many of the big providers, you know, Office 365, Google, you know, they give you the ability to actually control how data is actually going to be stored on a device. You know, you don't actually have to turn encryption on your phone. However, if controlled unclassified information or covered defense information, if it's going to be stored on a mobile device, then it has to be encrypted. So using these mobile device management utilities or products, it can actually allow you to enforce or to force a user who wants to use their device to increase their productivity, maybe Maybe you don't issue cell phones to your employees, and they want to be able to check their email. But maybe they want to put their email on their phone. Okay, if they want to put their email on their phone, you use a mobile device management solution that says, okay, I'm going to force you to encrypt your device if you're actually going to have access. So rather than just having unfettered access to the environment, you can actually put some rules in place to govern how their devices are actually going to connect.
And and I'm sure most of the people on the call are aware of all these opportunities. Now, O365 doesn't actually encrypt my phone, right? It just makes sure my phone's encrypted before it allows to connect. Isn't that how it works?
Yes, absolutely. So, Colin, before we go forward, I just want to address a question that came in regarding Microsoft Commercial Cloud Solutions. So, I will say that I can't speak definitively for the Department of Defense, but what the DFARS clause says is that if you're going to use CUI, it has to be in a FedRAMP moderate baseline system and also meet the incident reporting requirements from C through G. What Microsoft has said is that they can do that, but likely they will not do that, and they will not certify that they will do that in the multi-tenant environment, just from a liability standpoint. If they had to provide a forensics image, say for my company, that forensic image may include information from another company as well. So they're not attesting that they're actually going to do that. So you would definitely have to be in conversation with Microsoft based on where your data is actually stored, on whether or not they're going to provide you any level of attestation that they're going to fully meet that clause regarding supporting investigations that may have to happen. So I want to offer the comment that way because definitely I can't definitively say go, no go regarding it. But based on what the DFAR clause stipulates and based on what Microsoft is saying they will provide, they don't seem to go hand in hand, even though they do keep that information. I just don't know, without the government forcing them to do it, that they're going to necessarily comply with that. But again, the name Colin mentioned, Richard Wakeman, he can definitely provide, and he will respond to emails if you email him. He can definitely provide information specifically pertaining to that information. But I don't want to get, myself or Sarah Brand in trouble with the Department of Defense. That's not at all what we're trying to do there.
Absolutely. So, yeah, and, just to follow along with that, it is Microsoft's, the DoD can't say whether O365 is good or not outside of, does Microsoft at this point attest to meeting those requirements? So it's really up to Microsoft on how they want to, if they can meet those requirements as established. Again, Microsoft, is FedRAMP, but it's those incident response requirements which are difficult for them to meet. But and this is a long-term discussion. We'll see how it all plays out. So we're going to go next to enforce ground rules. All good times. Ooh, group policy. That's good.
So, group policy is a product that, simple things like, and I don't want to just limit it to group policy. Group policy is typically a term reserved for Microsoft. So you can use third-party software applications to provide similar functionality. You should have a screensaver in place that enacts after a certain period of inactivity. And group policy can actually configure that on all of your systems for you, rather than you going system by system and making those changes. Similar with account lockouts or session terminations. Any high-level functionality that you want to provide, if you're in a domain environment, you can use group policy. If you're not in a domain environment, there are different third-party applications that can provide similar functionality. So we don't necessarily want to push you towards one product or another, but a simple Google search can definitely, let you be aware of different patch management or configuration management tools that can administer, Microsoft systems or Apple systems or even Linux systems to provide this type of functionality that will be required. Even from an encryption standpoint, there are many products that can manage if you use Microsoft and you want to use BitLocker. BitLocker is on the FIPS, cryptographic module validation list. So if you want to use BitLocker, you don't necessarily have to employ it using Active Directory. There are other third-party applications that can both turn on BitLocker for you and store your encryption keys as well. And I think we talked about the mobile device management and how we can help enforce those rules. Specifically, you have to encrypt CUI on a mobile device. So if you're going to allow them to connect to your GCC email system or your GCC high email system or whatever other product you may be using, it can enforce rules to make sure that it's encrypted appropriately.
Now, one thing with the mobile devices, and it goes into your wireless point too, is so these personally owned devices, should they be connecting to the corporate wireless?
Absolutely not. Once you connect, anything that you connect to your corporate network, you introduce risk. So your personally owned devices, though there are some products out there that can do posture checks to determine the level of security that's on a personally owned device, just in practice is not a good idea. It'd be more advantageous. I mean, there's arguments that could be made that where you can say, okay, we're going to create a program and we're going to inventory our employee assets and we're going to validate that this specific asset is there. Well, the issue is they're still the administrators on their systems, and they can do things to cause harm to your network. So it's just as a best practice, you should only allow company-owned devices to connect to your network, and that includes wireless as well. There are many good products out there that offer unified access points that can have a guest wireless network, and it's using the exact same hardware, and the firewalling is built into the access points, and it just routes them to the internet. So you don't even really have to manage much, and you can do quality of service on those as well. And what I mean by that is you can determine how much speed they actually get. If you don't want them to be able to stream videos, well, you limit the bandwidth that's coming over that guest access, then they may not be able to do those things. So you can have a secure environment where you offer wireless for your employees' personal devices. Some of you may work in manufacturing. You may be inside of a big building where you don't get a cell phone signal. So as a nice gesture, you may want to allow them to connect their mobile device so that they can receive text messages while they're in the facility. Well, if you do that, you want to put those devices on that guest network that's firewalled off from everything else, and it only goes to the internet.
Very nice. And following the same line as the secure wireless access, you have WPA2, Radius, and 802.1x. Those are all
right. So
things.
You're required to have encryption. I just threw a couple of words up there as mechanisms to either provide encryption or authentication. There are different ways to provide authentication. If you're going to provide authentication, it'd be a good idea. I mean, obviously, one of the best options is using maybe certificate-based or maybe Radius using Active Directory. That's if you're using Active Directory. Something that's a little bit better than just a pre-shared key, because obviously with a pre-shared key, it may be easy to compromise that pre-shared key, and you don't want to have to keep changing your pre-shared key every time you change employees. So obviously it works from an authentication standpoint, but there probably should be something in place that says we're going to change our pre-shared key periodically so that we can withstand changes to employees. We're going to be able to withstand maybe a husband or a wife that decided to give that code to their spouse when they came into the office. So you got an extra device that's riding on your network now. But there are more secure options available that aren't very expensive to be able to implement. A lot of the devices that you may be using today may offer some of this functionality. It just may require a little research to determine, what's available with the products that you're using so that you can ramp up the security on those at a low cost from both an experience standpoint and a financial burden as well.
Very nice. And we kind of touched on the secure remote access previously. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about the VDI. I know that's near and dear to your heart, and for small businesses, sometimes it makes sense.
Absolutely. So I was actually talking to a client, I believe, last week, and one of the things that they mentioned is we have CUI in our environment, but it's only one person who uses it, and that's the only person that needs access to it. So one thing you can do is you can greatly reduce the scope of what you actually have to fulfill all these requirements on by using some level of virtual desktop infrastructure that may be hosted with maybe like an Amazon Web Services or a Microsoft Azure. Because if all you need is one system to hold CUI, If you put that in the cloud, you reduce how much effort you actually have to put into it. You know, Amazon has a product called Amazon Workspaces, where they actually patch the systems for you. Microsoft has a program called Microsoft Virtual Desktops, where they actually patch those systems for you. And from start to finish, you know, in a few hours, you could potentially have a system in the cloud that's operating and meeting the requirements. Obviously, with CMMC, you're going to have to put some documentation, you know, around your policies and procedures along with it, but you could have an easy to maintain environment very quickly using some level of virtual desktop infrastructure. And even if you decided, okay, we're big enough, we're going to host it on site, you can do the same thing. You can actually create an environment that's maybe separated by a firewall internally, and for those who need to access the CUI environment, create some remote way where they can actually remote over to the virtual desktop side. And those are methods designed purely to reduce the scope of what your environment is. So rather than fulfill 130 requirements across the entire network, maybe you want to do 130 requirements on 5 devices instead.
That makes sense. So yeah, I recall we were working with a company this several years ago, and they'd been in business for 100 years, and you know, they had dozens of Windows 2003 servers that they were going to have to migrate off of, but they, you know, 10% of their business was DoD work, and the cost to get compliant was going to be huge, compared to, although they should have done it anyways, but that's different. But going to a much smaller enclave type setup is saved them quite a bit of effort and money. And if I recall, having that separate security domain, that's a level 4 control, if I recall, right?
Absolutely. The full up separate security domain, absolutely.
So yeah, if you establish a security domain, apparently you've got better security. So you know, sometimes establishing that separate infrastructure makes a lot of sense. So I think that was the last part of yours. So I know we have some questions over on this side.
So I wanted to address the one question that was at the one about the few computers on the network, the work group environment.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding, few computers on the network are on a work group network. So if you could provide a little bit more substance just to determine, are you saying that those are the devices that will have actually access to CUI, and that's it? If you could just provide a little more information to say, if that's the case, without having that information, I'll say that if you have a small number of computers and that's going to be your CUI environment and you do not have a domain, there's actually some good things in there for you regarding things like MFA, because, you know, what the requirement is if you're going to use an account that requires a network to gain access to it, then you have to MFA into it. If you're going to have a system that has local accounts on it, then that requirement isn't the same. You're required to MFA for your administrative or your privileged use, but just for your regular logging in to a system that's using a local system account, that's actually sufficient. So that would be your directory at that point. So you don't have to use a directory service like Active Directory or some other program to centralize directory access. You can actually have accounts for your users on a local system without having to worry about the rest of that. And I'm hoping that addresses the question. Like I said, I'm not 100% sure of the angle of that question.
I
was hoping that they just maybe type a add-on question to it, just to, you know, provide more substance to it.
Well, if here we go. So they have MFA, and again, I mean, probably the hard part, Alexi, you can correct me if I'm wrong, would be ensuring that all of the configuration is the same, and then keeping all the systems patched has to be done individually, unless they go with some other third-party system.
Absolutely, that is always the tough part when you have the work group environment. Sometimes it can be tough, you know, for patch management and things like that. You know, unless you're connecting them online, but then, you know, when you deal with that work group and you have the like you mentioned, machine application dependency. Is it hopefully you're able to use operating systems that are still supported, but I know depending on your environment, you may be using Windows 7 or Windows XP in some cases. So those can be rather nightmarish, and you definitely want to isolate those. I know that's a different domain that we'll talk about at some later time, but if you're still running Windows 7, at least subscribe to Microsoft Extended Security Updates so that you can still get some patching on those devices, if they have to be used. Support didn't go away completely. It's just a pay to play at this point to continue to get updates.
All right, and so Mark is asking, will there be a webinar on how to identify and mark CUI documents and how to mark CUI files digitally? So we will.
I don't know that we're going to offer that because we're not the authoritative source on that. So here's one thing that I'll just go ahead and address, that every client that I deal with, as a function of my employment with Cerebrand, this is always a question or always a comment. The government doesn't tell us what CUI. The government doesn't mark anything CUI. So I would just say to archives.gov has a CUI marking guide. I'll drop that in the chat area so that you can see it. But it has a CUI marking guide that shows you what all the markings are supposed to look like. Now, whether or not the people who may send you CUI are actually using them, that's a complete separate story. So some people have this idea that, well, the data's not adequately marked when I receive it, so I don't know if it's CUI or not. I will say sometimes you have to err on the side of caution and at least ask them the question, hey, what you provided me looked like it might be CUI, but you didn't put any markings on it. It's okay to go back to who's giving you data and asking them, hey, what did you just give me? This seems like it's CUI. I need you to weigh in on this because this is a really difficult area. Now, like I said, this isn't trained. We're not the experts on CUI data itself. There is a lot of training videos available on archives.gov/CUI. And like I said, there is a CUI marking guide that kind of goes over exactly what the markings are supposed to look like, what the distribution labels are, and things like that. But it's a great question that we get regularly that we can't really answer.
And one note is that the DoD put out the CUI instruction this year. I forget which month. So there's a new CUI instruction out to the DoD, which will hopefully cause more marking to occur from your customer. So that's what we're hoping will lead to change over the next couple of years, is that documents will be better marked as they come down to you. And so you'll have a better idea of what is and what is not CUI.
And that's a great follow-on question. I've looked at the CUI marking guide. I don't remember for sure if it covers how you actually mark directories to denote that CUI is in them or not. But like I said, there is a CUI marking guide, and then Colin just referenced the DoD CUI instruction. So it may contain the information that you're talking about. We know that a DLP solution, you mentioned DLP, a DLP solution will likely help because DLP solutions can actually tag data with certain classifications. So that would provide some level of digital marking for you. But in terms of a directory, like if you have on a file share, I'm not 100% sure. I can't answer that question as far as what that digital marking should look like on like a file server, or maybe even on on a web directory like in a SharePoint or something like that. But hopefully the marking guide either provides that information or points to what should be done in that case. I'm actually dropping the link to the CUI training out in the chat area as well.
So an option, to Mark's point, is you may start with some sort of ediscovery software, and then I would start with distribution statements. Those are typically marked fairly well at this point. So anything distribution B through F is CUI. And with some of the ediscovery software out there, you may be able to at least start there with a search. There is no good mechanism at this point, but that may get you started.
In worst case scenario, if you have a folder out there and you know you're going to store CUI in it, in the name of the folder, it won't hurt you at all to put a category marking in the name of the folder. I'm actually dropping a link to the CUI marking guide as well in the chat area.
All right,
I know that.
Perfect.
I know that previously, when I worked in an environment that had this type of information, I can't say that it was right and I can't say that it was wrong, but we didn't have a requirement for how we marked our folders. Our requirements were still on the document itself, but what we tried to do was at least provide something on the outside of it that would say what type of document it was. But, you know, I don't know that it was, whether it was a requirement or not. So again, it was a former me, you know, before I started doing this, so I could have very well been wrong.
So, hold on a second.
If I'm not mistaken, in one of the marking trainings, it mentions that it talks about when you're using a computer network, it talked about the system use notifications and making sure that it's known that CUI exists within the network. But I just don't recall it going deeply into how you would actually do it for a folder structure, or if there was a requirement for it.
Okay, so, and we'll wrap up here in a second. I think some of your responses, Alexi, were just coming to me. So,
oh, really?
I'm dropping you. Yeah,
you may have to repaste a couple things I said there.
Yeah, I'm repasting them. Ryan, are you seeing the links now?
Okay, yeah, I have it on
Okay,
all
awesome.
panelists. I'm not sure why I did that. Oh,
Yeah.
because I said all panelists. I needed to
Yeah.
say panelists and attendees.
Yeah.
So we're smart in certain levels of technology, but not in others. And that's specifically for me.
We're off. Yeah. So Alexi, go ahead, but Windows 7.
Oh, I was actually about to type it. Yeah, so Windows 7, like I said, they offer extended security updates. And those extended security updates is where Microsoft will actually provide you patches for those items. Now, what I'm not sure about is whether or not they will allow you to patch them offline. So that would be more of a question for Microsoft. If you subscribe to this extended security updates, they may allow you to actually download those patches and bring them into those environments if they're not internet connected. But I know that they offer it, but exactly how they offer it, that I can't 100% speak to.
I think, Alexi, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up at this point. We're just about at an hour point. And to everybody else, if you have any other follow-up questions or just want to make a comment, here, I'll go ahead and put my email address. There's the info@SarahBren. If you want to email us directly, feel free, and we can address it that way. So.
And I dropped mine out there as well to Hall.
Did you? Okay,
yes.
Perfect. I was going to type yours out right there. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a wonderful Thursday afternoon, and stay safe out there with all this virus stuff. Thank you.